Stay together. Do not be afraid. Gold dust danced in the warm afternoon air as Thomas Mitchell pulled the reins of his wagon on the dusty road that led back to the ranch. The Texas heat was merciless in that summer of 1863, and sweat ran down his face, scarred by years of work under the inclement sun. His calloused hands held the reins tightly as the horses advanced at a steady pace along the familiar trail. It was then that he saw them. Two small figures sitting by the side of the road, hugging each other as if they were the only real thing left in the world. The oldest boy must have been no more than 12 years old, and he held to his breast a child who could barely walk on his own. His clothes were torn and covered with dust, and his bare feet showed the signs of a long walk. Thomas pulled the reins and stopped the wagon a few feet ahead. The silence of the desert was broken only by the noise of the harnesses and the weary blowing of the horses. He slowly descended, watching as the older boy cowered and pulled the little boy closer to him, like a cub protecting another from an unknown predator. The boy's eyes were too big for his thin face, and there was a sadness in them that no child should carry. The youngest, a girl of perhaps 3 years old, looked at Thomas with curiosity mixed with fear, his small fingers clutching his brother's tattered shirt. Thomas approached slowly, removing the hat from his head as a sign of respect. Its shadow offered a brief reprieve from the scorching sun that punished the two small figures. He crouched in front of her, placing himself at the level of the boy's eyes. The farmer knew how to recognize helplessness when he saw it. He had grown up in those barren lands. He knew the dangers that lurked in the unprotected in the vast territory of the West. He also knew that 2 children alone on the road did not get there by chance. Some tragedy had taken from them everything they knew as home. The older boy tried to speak, but his voice came out only as a hoarse whisper. He pointed vaguely to the horizon, in the direction they had come from, and Thomas understood without needing words. There was nothing left for them in that direction. There was no one else. The little girl began to cry softly, a fragile sound that was lost in the hot desert wind. The brother rocked her gently, murmuring words of comfort that Thomas could not hear, but whose meaning was clear in the tenderness of the gesture. At that moment, under the merciless Texas sun, Thomas Mitchell made a decision that would change not only the lives of those 2 children, but also his own. He reached out to the boy, a simple gesture that carried the silent promise of protection. The boy hesitated for a long moment, his eyes searching for some sign of security on the farmer's aged face. Then, slowly, he placed his small, dirty hand in Thomas's calloused palm, and for the first time in many days, something resembling hope flashed in his weary eyes. Thomas helped them into the wagon, settling them in between the bags of supplies he had bought in town. The girl nestled against her brother, who kept his protective arms around her throughout the trip back to the ranch. As the wagon bobbed along the dusty road, Thomas looked through the small mirror at the 2 figures behind him. The boy kept his eyes alert, always vigilant, even in exhaustion. Premature responsibility weighed on his youthful shoulders like an invisible burden. Thomas Mitchell's ranch appeared on the horizon as the sun began to tilt westward, painting the sky with orange hues that reflected in the windows of the simple but solid house. It was a place built with his own hands, every board and every stone placed with purpose and determination. When the wagon finally stopped in front of the porch, Thomas turned to the children. They looked at the house with a mixture of wonder and uncertainty, as if they couldn't believe that this place could represent security after being lost in the world for so long. The farmer got down and stretched out his arms to help them. The girl hesitated only for a moment before letting herself be carried, and the boy went down alone, keeping close so as not to be separated from his sister. There, in the golden light of the late afternoon, 3 destinies intertwined in a way that none of them could have predicted. Thomas Mitchell, the lone farmer who had spent so many years working his land with no company other than horses and cattle, discovered that his house too big for one man had finally found its true purpose. And the two children, who had wandered down the dusty road, carrying only each other and the fragile hope of surviving another day, discovered that sometimes fate puts angels disguised as farmers in the path of those who need protection the most. The first few days on the ranch were like taming a frightened colt, filled with care, patience, and small progress that was worth more than any gold found in the Texas hills. Thomas found out that the boy was named Samuel, and the little one was Emma. The names came out in shy whispers during their first hot meal in weeks. Samuel was 11, not 12 as Thomas had thought, but his eyes carried the bitter wisdom of one who had seen the world crumble too soon. Emma had just turned 3, and she was still looking for her parents in every corner of the house, asking in her childish language when they would return home. The routine of the ranch naturally adjusted to the presence of the children. Thomas woke up before dawn, as he always did, but now his steps were more careful not to wake the little ones who slept in the guest room. He had made 2 simple but comfortable beds and watched with a heavy heart as Samuel insisted on sleeping on the floor beside Emma's bed, standing guard even in his sleep. During the day, the children followed him through the fields like silent shadows. Samuel watched Thomas's every move with intense attention, as if he were memorizing every gesture, every decision. The boy had a hunger for learning that went beyond necessity. It was as if he wanted to make himself useful as quickly as possible to make sure he and his sister weren't sent away. Emma was different. The girl explored the world with the natural curiosity of her age, but always keeping Samuel in sight. She discovered the barn cats and spent hours watching the chickens in the yard, laughing for the first time since they arrived when a stubborn chick tried to follow a butterfly. Thomas noted how Samuel always stood between Emma and any situation that might pose danger, even when there was no real threat. The boy carried invisible scars that Thomas recognized. They were the same ones he had carried after losing his parents at a young age. One afternoon, while Thomas was mending a broken fence, Samuel approached Emma by the hand. The boy stood still for a few minutes, watching the work, before timidly offering his help. Thomas handed him some small tools and showed him how to hold the nails. The boy's hands trembled slightly, not with fear, but with determination. Emma sat on the grass nearby, playing with some wildflowers she had found, humming a melody she should have learned from her mother. The girl's sweet voice floated in the warm afternoon air, mingling with the sound of hammers and the distant mooing of cattle. It was during this afternoon of shared work that Thomas realized something important. Samuel wasn't just a boy trying to protect his sister. He was a child trying to grow up too quickly, carrying responsibilities that shouldn't be his. That night, after the kids went to bed, Thomas stood on the porch watching the stars. The night wind brought with it memories of his own lonely childhood, of the years he worked hard to prove his worth to the strangers who took him in. He didn't want Samuel to feel that same pressure. The next day, Thomas made a decision. Instead of taking the children to work in the fields, he took them to the old abandoned school in the nearest town. The building had closed years earlier when the teacher moved east, but the books were still there, covered in dust but intact. Samuel looked at the books with an almost religious reverence. His little hands passed through the pages as if they were precious treasures, and Thomas saw in the boy's eyes a light that had been absent since he met him on the road. Emma was fascinated by the colorful illustrations in a children's storybook. She would point to the drawings and ask questions in her high-pitched voice, forcing Samuel to break out of his usual silence to explain the figures. Thomas spent the afternoon teaching Samuel how to read the most difficult words, while Emma played with the wooden blocks they found in an old box. The sound of the girl's laughter echoed through the empty room, filling her with life again after years of silence. When they returned to the ranch at the end of the day, Samuel was carrying 3 books that Thomas had allowed him to take. The boy held them to his chest as if they were the most valuable thing in the world. And perhaps they were. They represented a future beyond mere survival. That evening, after dinner, Thomas heard Samuel quietly reading to Emma in their room. The boy's voice had lost some of its constant tension, replaced by something Thomas hadn't heard in a long time, the sound of childhood slowly returning. But life in the West never allowed peace to last long. The following week, Thomas noticed strange horsemen passing along the road leading to the ranch. They did not stop, but their presence left a trail of unrest in the air. Samuel had noticed them too. Thomas watched as the boy grew more tense, more vigilant, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon as if expecting to see something he would rather not find. Emma, protected by the innocence of age, continued to play and explore, oblivious to the worries that were beginning to weigh on the shoulders of the two men in the house. One who had learned to be cautious through years of experience, and the other who had learned through the premature loss of everything she loved. Thomas knew he couldn't protect children from all the dangers of the world, but he was determined to give them something that no one could take away, the feeling of belonging somewhere, of having a real home where they could simply be children. And as he watched Samuel help Emma draw letters in the backyard sand, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the deep satisfaction of knowing that his life had a greater purpose than just working the land and tending to livestock. He was building a family, brick by brick, moment by moment, with all the patience and determination he had used to build his ranch from nothing. Autumn arrived in Texas with cooler winds and a sky that seemed to carry grim promises. Thomas had noticed subtle changes in the landscape, fewer travelers on the main road, whispered conversations in the city, and a kind of tension in the air he knew well from the hard times. Samuel now read fluently, devouring every book Thomas could find on his travels to the city. The boy had grown a few inches during the months on the ranch, and his shoulders were beginning to widen with daily work in the fields. But Thomas watched with concern as the boy's eyes still constantly scanned the horizon, as if he expected the past to come for them at any moment. Emma had turned into a little golden light in Thomas's day. She ran around the property with the confidence of someone who had finally found her place in the world, and her crystal-clear laughter became the soundtrack to mornings at the ranch. The girl had begun to call Thomas Daddy Tom, and every time she heard these words, something lit up in the farmer's chest. It was one morning in November that trouble finally reached them. Thomas was in the barn helping Samuel stack hay when he heard the sound of horses approaching rapidly. It wasn't the calm pace of ordinary travelers. It was the urgent gallop of men in a hurry. He motioned for Samuel to be quiet and approached the barn door. 3 men stopped in the front courtyard, their dusty clothes suggesting a long drive. The leader of the group was a tall, thin man with visible scars on his face and cold eyes that seemed to evaluate every detail of the property. The other 2 were younger, but there was something about the way they positioned themselves that spoke of experience with dangerous situations. Thomas walked out of the barn slowly, keeping his hands visible and away from any tools that could be interpreted as a threat. Behind him, he heard Samuel breathing irregularly. The boy had recognized something in these strangers. The tall man dismounted and approached Thomas with a smile that did not reach his eyes. He asked about 2 children who had passed through the area a few months earlier, a boy and a young girl, orphans who had fled a plight in the East. Thomas kept his voice steady and calm when he replied that many people passed by his property and that he did not specifically remember 2 children traveling alone. The stranger studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to read the truth behind the words. It was then that Emma appeared running around the corner of the house, chasing one of the barn cats. She stopped abruptly when she saw the strangers, and something changed in her childlike expression, a shadow of recognition and fear that made Thomas's heart race. The tall man smiled, but this time the smile carried a predatory satisfaction. He crouched down at Emma's height and spoke to her in a falsely gentle tone, asking if she remembered him and saying that he had come to pick her up to take her home. Emma instinctively recoiled, her little feet stumbling in her haste to pull away. She looked desperately around, looking for Samuel, and when she didn't see him, she began to call out to her brother in a heartbreaking voice. Thomas stepped forward, placing himself between Emma and the stranger. His voice lost all warmth as he said that the girl clearly did not want to go with them, and that there was no reason to force a frightened child to leave a place where he was safe and happy. The tall man slowly straightened, his hand instinctively moving to the side where Thomas knew he should carry a pistol. He explained that the children had run away from relatives who had legal rights to them, and that he had been hired to bring them back. But Thomas knew lies when he heard them. There was something about the way the man spoke, the way he avoided giving specific details, that revealed his true intentions. These were not people who cared about the well-being of children. It was at this moment that Samuel appeared at the door of the barn. The boy had become pale as paper, and Thomas saw his little hands trembling, but instead of running or hiding, Samuel walked determinedly until he was next to Emma, putting his protective arms around his sister. The tall man laughed when he saw Samuel, a humorless sound that cut through the afternoon air like a blade. He said that the boy had caused a lot of trouble when he ran away, and that this time there would be no chance of him escaping again. Thomas felt something cold and hard form in his chest. He had spent months watching these children slowly heal from the traumas they carried. He had seen Samuel regain his childhood little by little, and Emma bloom like a flower in the desert. He wasn't going to allow strangers to come and destroy all of this. He told the men that the children were under his protection now, and that they would not go anywhere against his will. The tone of his voice carried a steadfastness that had come from years of working difficult lands and facing all the challenges that the West could offer. The tall man studied Thomas for a long moment, his eyes calculating the chances of getting what he wanted by force. Thomas knew he was outnumbered. 3 armed men against a farmer with 2 children to protect, but he also knew that some things were worth more than his own safety. The tension in the air was palpable when the stranger finally spoke again. He said he would return the next day with proper documents, and that he hoped Thomas would be more reasonable after thinking the situation through. The 3 men mounted their horses and drove off, but not before the leader gave the children one last menacing look. Thomas watched until they disappeared into the dusty road, knowing that the approaching night would be one of the longest of his life. When she turned to Samuel and Emma, she saw that the boy was hugging his sister tightly, whispering the same words Thomas had heard on the first day. "Stay together. Do not be afraid." But this time, Thomas knew that words carried a different weight. The storm was approaching, and he would have to find a way to protect the family he had learned to love more than life itself. Night fell on the ranch like a heavy cloak laden with forebodings. Thomas had locked every door and window, checked every lock twice, but he knew it wasn't physical barriers that would protect his family. It was the determination that burned in his chest like red-hot iron. Samuel couldn't sleep. The boy sat on the edge of Emma's bed, watching his sister, who had finally fallen asleep after a long time of crying softly. Her small hands still held one of the wooden toys Thomas had carved for her, and on her angelic face there were no more signs of the fear that had consumed her during the day. Thomas spent the night in the kitchen, drinking coffee and planning. He knew men like those. They weren't the type to give up easily, and when they did, it wouldn't just be to talk. The farmer had faced many storms in his life, but he never had as much to lose as he does now. When the first ray of sunlight appeared on the horizon, Thomas made a decision that would change everything. He woke the children gently and prepared a special meal, pancakes with honey, fresh eggs and warm milk. Samuel realized that it was no ordinary breakfast, but he didn't ask questions. After they ate, Thomas sat down at the table and looked at the 2 children who had turned his empty home into a real home. He said that they needed to make a trip, and that it might be time for them to visit the judge in the big city 3 days' ride away. Samuel understood immediately. His eyes filled with gratitude so deep that it made Thomas's voice crackle for a moment. The boy asked if Thomas was sure, if he really wanted to face all the problems that this could bring. Thomas held Samuel's small hands between his calloused hands and said that a true family did not abandon its members when difficulties appeared. He had found two lost treasures on the dusty road, and he wasn't going to let anyone take them away. Emma, not fully understanding the gravity of the situation, was excited by the idea of an adventure. She ran to pack her few belongings into the small bundle Thomas had made for her, humming the melody that always calmed the tense moments. They set out when the sun was still low in the sky, taking only the essentials. Thomas knew that the three men would probably return before noon, and he wanted to be away from there when that happened. The wagon followed the back trail, avoiding the main road where they could be seen. The trip was long but full of precious moments. Samuel helped Thomas take care of the horses and set up camp during the stops. Emma discovered wildflowers she didn't know about and filled her days with her discoveries and laughter. In the evenings around the campfire, Thomas told stories of his own youth, and for the first time, he talked about how he too had lost his parents early and been taken in by kind-hearted strangers. On the third day, they arrived in the town, where Judge Morrison, an honest man whom Thomas had known for many years, lived. The judge listened to the story carefully, noting how Samuel remained protective of Emma, and how both children looked at Thomas with the absolute trust that only exists between true family members. The papers were signed on a golden December afternoon. Thomas Mitchell officially became Samuel and Emma's adoptive father, and they became his legal children under the law. When the judge slammed the gavel sealing the decision, Emma applauded as if it were a party, and Samuel hugged Thomas with a strength that spoke of years of pent-up gratitude. They stayed in town for a few days, buying new clothes for the kids and supplies for the ranch. Samuel chose more books, and Emma got a rag doll that made her smile for days on end. Thomas felt more complete than he had ever felt in his life. The return trip was different from the outward trip. There was no more hurry, no more fear of what they might find. They were a family now, officially recognized, and nothing and no one could change that. When they finally spotted the ranch on the horizon, Thomas saw that the three horsemen had been there. Signs of his presence were visible, the front door forced, some furniture overturned, clues to a failed search. But they were gone, probably realizing that their prey had escaped forever. Samuel watched the damage with mature eyes and said he would help Thomas fix everything. Emma, pragmatic as always, just asked if the cats were okay. When she found out that it was, she ran out to play as if nothing had happened. That night, after they had tidied up the house and dined together, Thomas herded the children into their beds. Emma was already fast asleep, holding her new doll, when Samuel called Thomas quietly. The boy, who was now 12 years old and had grown a lot during those difficult months, said he finally understood what it meant to have a real father. It wasn't just someone who gave you food and shelter, it was someone who stayed when things got dangerous, who fought for you, who chose you even when you could choose an easier life. Thomas felt his eyes fill with tears as he replied that Samuel and Emma had given him far more than he could ever repay. They had turned a house into a home, a lonely man into a father, and an empty existence into a meaningful life. Months later, when spring returned to Texas, the Mitchell Ranch was known in the region as a place of hospitality and kindness. Thomas raised his children firmly but affectionately. Samuel became a responsible and studious young man, and Emma grew like a flower in the desert, bringing joy to everyone around her. And whenever thunder appeared on the horizon, or when small fears of life visited the family, the words that had sealed their union on the first day still echoed through the house. Stay together. Do not be afraid. Because they had learned that a true family is not defined by the blood that flows through the veins, but by the love that flows between hearts. And in the unforgiving heat of the American West, where life could be harsh and unpredictable, they had found each other and built something that neither time nor hardship could destroy. The Mitchell Ranch continued to thrive for years to come, not just as a well-manicured property, but as a symbol that sometimes life's greatest treasures are found when we least expect it, on the dusty roads of fate, disguised as two lost children who needed just someone brave enough to say, "Come on, you are home now." And Dame, if this story has touched your heart and you want to follow more exciting narratives of the Wild West, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Leave in the comments which part of Thomas, Samuel and Emma's journey moved you the most. If this story has touched your heart and you want to follow more exciting narratives of the Wild West, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Leave in the comments which part of Thomas, Samuel and Emma's journey moved you the most.